So what are tissues? Last meeting, we talked about cells, okay? So cells are actually individual units, but when we put cells together on a functionally related group, now we're going to call it tissues. So the definition of tissue is a group of closely associated cells that perform related functions. And they're similar in structure. That is what a tissue would be. So now, we only are studying four types of tissue. There's only four types of tissue in the body. So the epithelial tissue is the first topic, and then we're going to continue on with the second one and third and fourth. So the other tissue is going to be connective, muscle tissue, and nervous tissue. But within those different tissues, there's a specific type under those specific tissue. So this is the first topic of histology. Tissue is histo in Latin. So the study of tissues is called histology. So we're going to start off with the epithelial tissue. And I'm going to actually give you examples so you can be interested in why we study these tissues, okay? So the epithelial tissue is the first one that we're going to be doing today. So mostly this tissue covers the body surface, okay? It's just your skin. Then it also lines the body cavity. So inside your body is a cavity. So what lines that tissue, okay, the wall, is called epithelial. So it is located, covers the body surface or lines the body cavity. That's actually a definition of what epithelial tissue is. Now, even though they're cells, some of this epithelial tissue are cells that actually secrete. They're actually called glands. Now, again, summary of the function of epithelium. Number one, protection. Number two, absorption, secretion, and ion transport. You're going to be talking about that in physiology. Filtration, also in physiology, and that's going to be at your kidney. And since it lines the lining of the cavity inside the body, it actually forms slippery surfaces. Now, let's take a look at an epithelium, okay, and what are its general characteristics, okay? Cell, 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 cell. We call it cellularity. Some other tissues, you probably just see a cell here, and a space, okay? So that's not epithelium. That's actually connective tissue. So what we're concentrating on epithelium, in which all over the place, it's made out of cell, cell, cell. Sometimes it goes into layers, cell, 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 cell on top. No, actually, there's less space between them. Now, the cells are having specialized contacts. So if you notice the cell joined to another cell, okay, remember, a cell has a cell wall, but they're attached to each other by what we call specialized contacts. So if you notice, this cell wall is attached to the cell wall by these specialized contacts. Then an epithelium also has polarity. So this is going to be the top portion of the cell, okay, and this is going to be the bottom portion of the cell. So the top portion of the cell is called the apical surface. The apical surface, the top portion of the cell, the epithelium, usually they're free because after that you got the space or the lumen or the cavity. But the bottom portion of the cell is called basal surface. They're actually embedded into a soil, okay? So the soil that you see underneath that is actually called a basement membrane. And then after that, the fourth type is it is supported by connective tissue. So epithelium always has something on the bottom called connective tissue. And then it is said to be avascular but innervated. What does avascular mean? No blood vessels. So if you take a look at the blood vessels, it actually is located at the connective tissue, not on the epithelium. That is avascular but innervated, meaning there's nerves that is innervating the epithelium. And then number 6 is very important because the number one characteristic of epithelium compared to the other tissue, it regenerates. If the cell dies, the neighboring cell will regenerate and cover the space, okay? Other tissues, such as your connective tissue, when they die, they don't regenerate. And then like muscle and also nerves, when they die, they don't regenerate. So you don't see any of this in the other tissues. This is only for epithelium. It regenerates. Apical epithelial special features, okay? So on top of the cell, sometimes it's not flat, okay? There's something that is actually protruding on top of the cell wall of an epithelium. One example is going to be the microvilli, okay? Usually you see the microvilli in the small intestinal tract. The reason why you have a lot of this, okay, so I'm going to draw a cell of an epithelium, okay? So this is an epithelial cell, right? And you have the basement membrane at the bottom. So other parts of the organ, they have the cell, okay, but they also have this extension on top, its apical surface, okay? And this is mostly seen at your intestinal tract. Next, what is a cilia? A cilia are whip-like extensions that is motile, meaning it moves, located at the apical surface. That is going to be the cell. Let's say this is the cell. It doesn't have cilia. And another part of the body, such as your respiratory tract, they have these whips, elongated extensions of the apical surface of the cell. So this is what we call a cilia. And remember, the cilia moves. They're not passive, okay? So you would understand why this is actually located at your respiratory tract, okay? So before we go into that, let's actually take a look at what a microvilli looks, okay? So this is enlarged, magnified view of the lining of the intestinal tract. All these extensions that you see on top of that cell is actually what you call your microvilli. This is what a cilia looks like, okay? So cilia is actually an extension of the respiratory tract because in your respiratory tract, on top of it is a layer of mucus. You always have mucus there because remember, when there's mucus on your respiratory tract, that is because every time you breathe air, you're actually breathing dust, okay? So these are within this air. So when you breathe dust, the dust will be trapped into that mucus, okay? So when they're trapped in the mucus, the cilia is pushing the mucus towards the throat, okay? And that cilia is the one that will allow the dust that is trapped in the mucus to be pushing the mucus with dust towards the throat so you can cough that dust out, okay? And now we're going to talk about epithelium. So I want to actually be able to identify in a microscope what kind of epithelium am I being pointed at. Epithelium can be classified either one layer of cells. So one layer, I'm going to call that epithelium simple. If it's more than one layer, I'm going to call that tissue of epithelium stratified. So again, now I can actually say this is squamous epithelium. This is stratified epithelium. Further classify based on the shape. Based on the shape, the flattened cell, the reason why I can see it's flat is because of the flattened nuclei. See that nuclei there? It's flat. If it's flat, we call it squamous. The description of squamous is wider than tall. The description of cuboidal is as tall and as wide. And then columnar is taller than wide. Now I can now classify the epithelium based on layers and shape. Simple squamous, simple cuboidal, simple columnar. Stratified squamous, stratified cuboidal, and stratified columnar. Now the only thing is, how does it look like on the microscope? Let's take a look at examples of simple squamous epithelium. That's the first thing. Simple squamous epithelium, single layer, flat cells. Remember the nuclei is flattened, this shape. A special type of epithelium that sometimes we have a special name for that, the lining of the blood vessel. Remember, this is your blood vessel. The lining of the blood vessel where the blood passes through that hole. It also means lumen. Take a look at the lining. I'm going to magnify this lining of this blood vessel. See that lining? It is actually made out of one layer of cell. So this is actually one layer, simple. The shape of the cell flattened. So this is an example of simple squamous epithelium. But The special name for the lining of the blood vessel called simple squamous epithelium is called endothelium, of the lining of the cavity in the person's body. The special name that we used to call that is called mesothelium. Simple squamous epithelium. Simple squamous epithelium. How many layers is it? It's only one. Explain me the shape of the cell of this lining of the alveoli of the lung. So this is a sac. Inside the sac, it's lined by cells. So tell me, how does it look like of this type of the lining of the lung? I've said it's simple squamous epithelium. Tell me, what is an example of simple squamous epithelium? This is the example of simple squamous epithelium. This is how it looks like on the microscope. You got a big space and you got a lining around this tissue, okay? This is simple squamous epithelium. So you notice there's flattened cell with nuclei, flattened cell, flattened cell, flattened cell, and it actually wraps around this ball. And this is because if I cut through that sac, this is the alveolar sac. If I cut it, I'm going to just see the edges of the alveoli. So if I show you this picture in your lab, is this epithelium? Is this connective tissue? Is it muscle tissue? We haven't actually seen it, but this is what the question they examine. Or is it nervous tissue? So what is the answer for this question on the lab? A, epithelium. The second question with the same picture. Is this simple squamous epithelium? Is it simple cuboidal epithelium? Is it simple columnar epithelium? Is it stratified squamous? Is it stratified cuboidal? Is it stratified columnar? And what is your answer? Simple squamous. One layer, flattened cells. I need you to be able to identify the slide and tell me, since we're all about epithelium, okay, tell me what type of epithelium it is. So I'm going to go to simple squamous epithelium. The next slide is simple cuboidal epithelium, okay? So this is what simple cuboidal epithelium looks like, okay? Remember, inside the kidney are tubes. The tubes are smaller than my hair, okay? Inside those tubes is where the urine passes through. You got a lot of those tubes. Sometimes I'm able to cut it crosswise, so it looks like a circle, but inside it is where urine passes through. Here, I was able to cut a tube longitudinal. That's why you see it goes long. Inside this tube is the cavity called the lumen. That's where the urine passes through inside the kidney. So these are microscopic tubes inside the kidney. So an example of simple cuboidal is kidney tubules. That's an example. And this is how it looks like. So this is a tube. Okay, remember, if I draw this 3D, this is actually a tube because it was cut cross-section. The cavity is here, and what lines that tube is one layer of cells around the tube. And I noticed that the nuclei is round, and the shape of the cell is square. So this is simple cuboidal epithelium, just one layer. Okay, sometimes I don't see a nuclei, but this is how it looks like. This is a tube. It's just like it is epithelium. And it's only one layer that rounds around that tube. So it's simple. And the shape of the cell is square. So this is simple cuboidal epithelium. An example of simple cuboidal epithelium is the kidney tubules. So moving on, we're going to move now to the next shape in one layer, simple columnar epithelium. This is located at your intestinal tract. So inside the intestinal tract, this is the wall of the tube of your intestinal tract. Inside the intestinal tract is lined by epithelium. So here it's magnified. This is a cell of the intestinal tract. And if you notice, there are small extensions on top of the cell. That's your microvilli, because you see microvilli in the lining of the intestinal tract. So in the slide, this is what you see. Okay, remember, this slide is taken from a digestive tract of a mice. The lining of that tube is taller than wide. and it's made out of one layer. So that's actually an example of what a simple columnar epithelium is, okay? Now, if you notice, there's like a shadow on top of the cell. That shadow is actually the microvilli. On the apical surface of the cell, that is going to be microvilli. How many layers of lining is inside the digestive tract? One layer. That's why I call it simple. What is the shape of the cell inside the lining of the digestive tract? Taller than wide, and I call it columnar. That is simple columnar epithelium. There's actually a special type of simple epithelium that actually looks like stratified, but in fact it is only one layer. But if you look at the microscope, it looks like multiple layers because you have a lot of nuclei in different layers. It is actually a misnomer that this is stratified. It is not stratified. It is actually one layer only. And this is how it looks like. It is one layer only, but the cells that lines the tube, this is going to be at the respiratory tract. This is going to be the trachea. And on top of the trachea are cilia. Okay? So remember those hair-like projections on top of the cell? That's actually your cilia. And it actually is one layer, but it looks like multiple layer. That's why we call it pseudo-stratified. Pseudo in Latin means false, not stratified. It only looks like stratified. And it's also pseudo-stratified ciliated because it has cilia on top of the cells. And the shape of the cells quite similar to columnar, and it is an epithelium. That's why we call it pseudo-stratified ciliated columnar epithelium. Okay, so that's actually this special type of one layer of cells, pseudo-stratified. The reason why it actually looks like multiple layers because the cells looks like pizza pies. It's only one layer, but they look like pizza pies, and the nucleus is located on the wider portion of the cell. That's why you can actually see it. Probably there's two layers. So if it's two layers, we call it stratified. But it's not. It's only one layer. So this is a special type of simple epithelium. Okay, it looks like columnar. It then has cilia. So we call it pseudo-stratified ciliated columnar epithelium. An example, trachea. The next group of tissue is going to be stratified, layered, stratified, layered. We're going to go the same way. I'm going to go with stratified squamous, stratified cuboidal, stratified columnar, in a special type of layered epithelium, transitional epithelium. I'm now moving into stratified. So what does stratified epithelium mean? Two or more layers. Now, two or more layers. So you got more than two layers. That means that the bottom layer is the one that regenerates and push the old cells on top. So the old cells on top will actually erode, okay? Such as your skin. So you notice that your skin, the old skin on top, you can peel it off by getting that scrub. It regenerates, okay? So the major role of stratified is usually protection, okay? And the name of the shape of the epithelium that we're going to use is based on the apical layer, the top layer. We're not basing it from the bottom layer because this is multiple layer. Usually the bottom layer, they're round, but when they actually go to the top, they become squashed, okay? And that's squamous. Sometimes it's made out of two layers, but all of them look like tall, two layers, stratified columnar, or two layers of cells that looks like boxes, two or three layers, stratified cuboidal. And then the special type of epithelium for the stratified is actually going to be the transitional. It's multiple layers, but on top of the layer it looks like big mushrooms. The cells looks like big mushrooms, okay? And that is actually transitional. So we have four stratified epithelium, okay? So the first one is we're going to start with stratified squamous. Stratified squamous epithelium, the top layer of the skin is squashed, and that is squamous, wider than tall. The deep layers of that epithelium is actually a little bit like cuboidal or columnar, but we don't base the stratified epithelium based on the bottom layer. We always base it from the top layer. And this is the thickest of the epithelium tissue, stratified squamous epithelium. That's the reason why it protects from abrasion. The reason why it protects abrasion because I have multiple layers in the top layer of the skin, so if I hit it on a rough surface, I don't see a wound. Okay, I just scrape off the top layer. That's the reason why the stratified squamous epithelium protects from abrasion. There's two types of stratified squamous epithelium. The stratified squamous epithelium can be keratinized or non-keratinized. One is keratinized. It means the top portion of the cell are dead cells. So this is the top layer of the skin, stratified squamous epithelium. From here to here is epithelium. And remember, it's multiple layers. So you got round at the bottom, and then after that, it keeps on becoming flat on top. But since it is keratinized, the upper layer here are dead cells. That's the reason why it protects us from abrasion. So when you say the word, the top layer of the stratified squamous epithelium, they are dead cells. We call it keratinized. An example is the one you see on your body, the skin. Now, where do you see stratified squamous non-keratinized? Okay, so this is an example inside the esophagus or the vagina or the cheek inside your mouth. That is stratified squamous epithelium, but it's different consistency on the lips compared to the skin because the epithelium is from here to here, and you notice that the top layer are living cells. They still have nucleus. Unlike here, they're dead cells, no nuclei on the top layer. So that's the reason why stratified squamous epithelium's example is going to be the lips, the inside of the mouth, the esophagus, the vaginal wall, even the anal canal. Let me use it in the clinical use, okay? Why is it? Want to get DNA from a person, I scrape off the inner lining of the mouth. And I cannot do it on my skin here. That means because inside the mouth, the top layer is non-keratinized. See, the top layer is non-keratinized. It still has nucleus. And what did I say about the cell? The nucleus have the DNA. So that is the reason why we do the swab for DNA swab in the side of your cheek, the inside of your cheek, and because it is non-keratinized. It has DNA. I cannot do it to keratinize, which is this one, okay? Because stratified squamous epithelium keratinized, the top layer, this is the stratified squamous epithelium up to here, all of these are dead cells or dead skin. So that is the two types of stratified squamous. One is keratinized and the other one is non-keratinized, okay? That is the first type of multiple layered epithelium. So now I'm gonna go to the next one, stratified cuboidal. So where do you see stratified cuboidal epithelium? Two layers of cuboidal cells that actually lines that tube called a duct. So it's easy to just say, because the example, all this epithelium is actually seen in the duct of the sweat gland, the mammary gland, and the salivary gland. The duct, not the gland. The gland is actually made out of the squamous epithelium. It secretes. But the duct, where the secretion of the gland goes to, it is lined by stratified cuboidal epithelium. So sometimes I say an example is the duct of the SMS, the duct of the salivary gland, the duct of the mammary gland, and the duct of the sweat gland. Lining of the tube, the nuclei is round, so that means that the cells are actually square, and it's made out of two layers inside that tube. So this is an example of stratified cuboidal epithelium. And then the next one is going to be, since we did cuboidal, we're going to do columnar, stratified columnar. But stratified columnar is actually rare. So the place where you see stratified columnar epithelium is the male urethra, the lining of the male urethra, which is actually where the urine passes through in the genital organ of a male. It's lined by stratified columnar. So if you take a look at the male urethra, where the urine comes from the bladder and then it exits out here. And what lines the urethra are epithelium. So epithelium is actually going to be from here to here. And it looks like it's more than one layer. It is one layer, more than one layer. That's why we call it stratified. And the top layer is columnar, column shape. The last of the stratified epithelium is actually called transitional epithelium. So what is the difference between this type of epithelium? It is actually also layered, but if I take a look at a sample that lines the urinary bladder and the ureter, the lining of the tube, where is the ureter located at? This is going to be your ureter, the tube connecting the gate into the bladder, and the walls of the bladder, of that sac bladder, is made out of epithelium. So from here to here is epithelium, and this is going to be the cavity or the lumen of the tube or the bladder. So if you notice that the top cells on top, they look like mushrooms, they're big compared to the bottom. So this is actually the specialist type of stratified epithelium called transitional epithelium. And where do you see this? Ureter and bladder. So this is the summary of what we went through, the different epithelium. We went through simple epithelium to stratified epithelium. We also went through an example of each, and we also look at how it looks like on the microscope. Give me an example of simple squamous epithelium, long alveoli. Give me an example, simple cuboidal epithelium, the kidney tubules. Give me an example of simple columnar epithelium, the GI tract. Give me an example of pseudostratified related columnar epithelium, trachea. Give me an example of stratified squamous non-keratinized. It's off the inside of the cheek, the vaginal canal, the anal canal. Now give me an example of stratified squamous epithelium keratinized, the skin of your body. Now give me an example of stratified cuboidal, the duct of the SMS. Tell me what is SMS.
The sweat gland, the mammary gland, and the salivary gland.
Now, give an example of stratified columnar, male urethra. Give an example of transitional epithelium, bladder and the ureter, not the urethra, ureter. Epithelium is also glands. So whatever this type of epithelium is, they're made out of squamous epithelium. So it's actually epithelium on top of each other, squamous epithelium. So they secrete something into a duct. But the glands, we call it exocrine glands, that is what they secrete, like sweat gland, they secrete sweat. Your mammary gland, they secrete milk. And then your salivary gland, they secrete saliva. It has ducts. But there's another kind of epithelium that is a gland. It doesn't have a duct. Those are your endocrine glands. They're the one that secretes hormones into the blood. All right, so now we're going to go and take a look at what it looks like on the microscope of the slides that we usually have on our lab. So we're going to now take a look at the epithelium now. So epithelium is actually either simple, first four are simple, and the last four are stratified, okay? So this is how it looks like. Simple is one layer of flattened cell. That's simple squamous, simple cuboidal, one layer of square-looking cells, and one layer of tall cells, columnar, and this is pseudostratified, okay? So just remember the description I use. Flattened cell squamous is actually wider than tall. Cuboidal is as wide and as tall. And then columnar is taller than wide. And then your pseudostratified is taller than wide, but it has cilia on top of it. And then the stratified is multiple layer, okay? So we have non-keratinized, in which the top layer is still living cells, and it is non-keratinized squamous, and the other one is non-keratinized keratinized squamous epithelium, in which the top layer are dead cells. Stratified cuboidal, about 2 layers of square-looking cells, or wider as wide as tall. Stratified columnar is going to be more than 2 layers of, usually 3 layers of your cells, and the top layer is taller, okay, taller than wide. And then transitional is the top layer of the cell is bigger compared to the bottom, okay, that's going to be a transitional, and you should be able to know where those examples are going to be, okay. So let's take a look at simple epithelium. We got 4 types. Now, simple squamous, again, this is another example of simple squamous. The lining of this wall that lines the inner tube of a blood vessel. okay? So this is an artery. Remember, that lining is simple squamous epithelium, single layered cell, flattened with a nucleus in the middle, and it goes around this cavity. And remember, the special name that we say the lining of the artery is called endothelium, okay? So that's exactly what an endothelium would look like. Now, if you notice, below that are smooth muscles, okay? So we haven't gone to the muscles yet, but in an organ, you should be able to see more than one tissue, okay? So this is a blood vessel. So you should see epithelium, you should see smooth muscle, you should see connective tissue. But we're concentrating on the epithelium, simple squamous epithelium or endothelium, okay? Now again, this is the single layer flattened cells with a nuclei, okay? And this picture is actually evident of alveoli, okay? So this is like an alveoli. Remember, alveoli are sacs. So if I cut them into a cross-sectional view, you'd see them like circles, okay? So you see that they're lined by one layer of epithelium and they're flattened, so simple squamous, long alveoli, okay? Again, long alveoli, okay? These are flattened cells, and this is simple squamous epithelium, okay? Simple squamous epithelium. So sometimes cells, depends on the cut, you can see a little bit of different shape, but the most common cells that lines the alveoli, this is a magnified view of the alveoli, is flattened cells, so simple squamous epithelium. This, again, lining around this blood vessel is simple squamous epithelium. See those flattened cells with a nuclei? Here's a flattened cell, but I don't see the nuclei because it depends on the cut. Flattened cells with nuclei. This is the lumen of the blood vessel. Okay, this is actually a vein, and that is going to be simple squamous epithelium. Again, we call it endothelium. Now, let's take a look at simple cuboidal. Again, this is a tube lined by cuboidal cells. Sometimes I don't see the nucleus here, but it depends on the cut, okay? But another way to verify, and if I see a cuboidal cell, it's actually take a look at the shape of the nucleus. If it's round, it is cuboidal, okay? So this is squamous, flattened nuclei, okay? I'm looking at the nucleus only. So if it's round, that's cuboidal. If the nucleus is elongated upward, that's columnar. So I'm just using the nuclei as another way to describe the shape of the cell, because sometimes when we do a section of a tissue, we really don't see the boundaries between one cell to another, okay? So it depends on the way it was cut. So this is simple cuboidal, and example is going to be the kidney tubules, okay? Simple cuboidal, okay? See the lining of this cavity, okay, is simple cuboidal. Okay, remember, the only thing you have to do is what type of epithelium? One layer, simple cuboidal, and example, alveoli. But this is actually the thyroid gland, okay? So the thyroid gland has also this lining of this cavity as simple cuboidal, okay? Another picture, okay? So I was able to cut through the tubule in a longitudinal axis is the lumen, but you can see the line is one layer of cuboidal cells. Okay, so that's actually also simple cuboidal, kidney tubules. Now again, this is the cross-section of that tubule, and the lining is one layer of cuboidal cells. Okay, so simple cuboidal epithelium. Now we're going to take a look at a simple epithelium. Okay, so again, example, digestive tract. Okay. So you can see that this is a single cell of your simple columnar epithelium. So this is actually a little bit tricky because the nucleus is actually round, okay? But this is tall, okay? So you can actually see some of the nucleus are a little bit elongated, that's fine. Sometimes you can actually just see it as round, okay? But you see that the cell is tall. This is simple columnar epithelium, okay? And if you notice that the top portion of the cell has some shadows. Since this is the digestive tract, that's going to be your microvilli. Okay, you only see in microvilli your digestive tract. Okay, now the same thing, okay, single layer, because I only have one layer of epithelium, so all of this is the epithelium, okay, tall-shaped cells, the nucleus is elongated, okay, and that is simple columnar, and the top layer of the cell has this shadow as your microvilli, okay. So remember, this is the lining of your digestive tract, so the food is passing through here. This is the cavity of the digestive tube. Again, this is how it looks like from a further view, but it is the same, one layer with nucleus, columnar, okay. My exam is going to be more magnified compared to what pictures we have here, okay. Now, again, simple columnar, one layer, elongated cells, okay. Simple columnar. These are glands. These are glands mixed with that epithelium. So they secrete mucus. Okay, we call it goblet cells. Right, and then this is simple columnar. Okay, one layer of nucleus, elongated nucleus upward, and you have the microvilli on top. Okay, that is simple columnar. So this is the epithelium that lines the cavity. Okay. All right, now we go to pseudostratified, ciliated. Okay, again, this is still simple epithelium. Now, if you notice that the pseudostratified, they look like multiple layers, but aside from that, the giveaway to this answer is going to be this elongated extensions on top. That is your cilia. Okay, so you see it on the trachea. Okay, that's how you can use how to identify the specimen by looking at some examples. Again, pseudostratified, you got elongated cilia at the apical surface of the epithelium. The epithelium is from here to here, okay? And whatever is actually projected upward is the extension called cilia. Now, this is more magnified, pseudostratified columnar, but you see the cilia on top. So, you know, it is pseudostratified ciliated columnar. Trachea is an example. Okay, now again, this is pseudostratified ciliated. You got those extensions on top, and from here to here is epithelium. Okay, anything below that is a different tissue, like connective tissue. Right? Again, this is simple pseudostratified columnar with cilia. You got those elongated extension on top. Okay. Trachea is an example. Now we're moving now to the stratified epithelium. There's actually the stratified more than one layer, but for the stratified squamous, we either have keratinized or non-keratinized. Okay, so here is keratinized. Why? The epithelium is actually from here to here. That's the epithelium. Okay, this is also the epithelial layer. I'm sorry, from here to here. Okay, and then from here to here. Why was this included? This is actually dead cells of that skin. So this is stratified squamous, epithelium, keratinized. Okay, so those are dead cells. Remember, 10% of dust around your house is made out of dead cells of the people who live in your house. 10% of that. Okay, because this top layer of the stratified squamous keratinized, they always shed off, okay? They always shed off. All right, again, take a look at this. From here to here is epithelium, okay? It's stratified. The top layer are flattened cells, so stratified squamous. But the extreme top of this epithelium are still living cells. You got a lot of this nuclei still on top. So this is stratified squamous non-keratinized. Example, esophagus. Okay. Again, from epithelium is from here to here. Okay. And the top layer still has nuclei. So we have stratified. The cells are flattened on top. Stratified squamous. And it has nuclei on top. So we call it stratified squamous non-keratinized. Okay. All right. So the epithelium is actually from here to here. Okay, so it is multiple layer. Top layer is flat, stratified squamous, but the top layer here is dead cells. So it is stratified squamous keratinized. Okay, so this is again stratified squamous keratinized. The epithelium is actually from here to here. Okay, because remember the skin has this wavy appearance on the epithelium. Okay, it looks like a wave, and also the epithelium is actually from here to here. Now the top layer are dead cells. This is the top layer. So this is stratified squamous keratinized. Okay, another picture of stratified squamous, epithelium from here to here. Top layer are flattened cells, so it's stratified squamous. And the top layer here are living cells because it also still has nuclei. I still see nuclei on top of it. Okay, so that is stratified squamous, non-keratinized. Non-keratinized skin, magnified. Epithelium is actually from here to here. Top layer still have nucleus. Okay, so it's non-keratinized. These are pictures that I'm going to be showing you for the exam, magnified and very clear. Okay, epithelium from here to here. Okay, and the top layer here, dead cells. Okay, I don't see nuclei there. Actually, the dead cells are actually a little bit deeper up to here. Okay, so this is keratinized, and this is an example of thick skin. That's why the stratum corneum is actually bigger. Thick skin is located at the area of the palm of your hand and the sole of your foot. Okay, it's still stratified squamous, keratinized. Now this is again stratified squamous keratinized. Okay, so from here to here is the epithelium. Okay, and you got a big layer of this dead cells from here to here. So this is either the sole of your foot. Okay, the sole of your foot or the palm of your hand. So that is dead cells on top. Okay, now we go to stratified cuboidal. That's two layers of round cells, round nucleus, multiple layers, and this is the lumen. This is stratified cuboidal. An example is the duct, okay, of the SMS, duct of the sweat, duct of the mammary, duct of the salivary. Right, stratified columnar. So you see that it's actually tall cells in about 2 layers. You see those stratified. So the cell is elongated, and this is stratified columnar. Okay. Example is. Anybody give me an example where you see stratified columnar? Rare, very rare.
Is it the male urethra?
Yes, male urethra. Okay, it's only one example. Very rare, and only the male urethra. Good job. Okay, stratified epithelium, transitional ureter bladder. Okay, so epithelium is actually from here to here. Okay, but if you notice, the top cells are actually very big. We call it apical cells. Okay, they look like mushrooms on top. So this is the bladder. Okay, again, this is going to be the bladder, the round apical cells on top. Okay, so it is transitional epithelium. Then again, this is transitional epithelium. Epithelium is actually from here to here. This is the cavity called the lumen of the urinary bladder. Now you notice that the top there is also big. Okay, so that tells you it's transitional. This is what a ureter looks like. Okay, so the cavity of the ureter is not a square. It looks like a star. Okay, it looks like a starfish. So this is the lumen of the ureter. And if you take a look at the top layer, they're big cells. That's why it is transitional. Okay, it was magnified now. So you see those top cells are big and round. So this is transitional epithelium. Okay, again, now more magnified, okay? So top layers are big cells. That is transitional epithelium.